time again for another installment of The Basics, and on today's show, in regards to the Star Trek CCG, I'm going to answer a question that was posed to me, and that is how I choose personnel for a deck. And it's the next hardest thing you have to do next to choosing your affiliation. So let's get started, shall we? Choosing the proper personnel for your deck is probably one of the most time-consuming portions of building a deck for the Star Trek CCG. And as I've mentioned on previous episodes that dealt with deck construction, you have to take into account the affiliation you're using as well as the missions that you want to try to achieve for points. I'm going to take you through what I look for when I'm adding personnel to a deck, regardless of the affiliation. I'll cover a lot of those. One of the first things that I want to mention is personnel that only have one skill, and a skill that is not applicable or useless. And I have to pick on Simon Tarsis here, because even though he's a medical personnel, his only skill is youth. And compared to other medical personnel that are in the game, it's a very useless card. I would rather have a medical personnel that has 2 or 3 secondary skills rather than just youth. A card like this is just, it's going to take up space. It's not something you want to put in your deck. And a card like Mott the Barber. Civilian cards are not that great to begin with. There are a few civilian cards that are awesome. I will show you a couple examples as I go through this. But a civilian card like Mott, where his only attribute, aside from being a civilian, is barbering. Completely useless in the game. It's not going to help you. It's not going to do anything. Now, in terms of actual personnel that I might put in a deck, for example, with Federation, Ro Laren. I've used her in a deck before. She's an officer. She has the minor staffing icon, but she has computer skill, navigation, and treachery. Treachery is an interesting skill to have for Federation, and a personnel that both has computer skill and navigation can only be an asset. Thomas McClure, he's security, and you're thinking, well, he only has 2 skills, leadership and exobiology. Those can actually come in handy, but more so than anything, he's a security that has the command icon next to him. That's very useful if you want to put him on a smaller ship or give him command of something to get it moving quicker. Reginald Barclay from the Voyager set. He's an engineer. He has the minor classification skill, but he has computer skill, astrophysics, honor, and if you're using him in Delta Quadrant Federation missions, if you solve them, they are 5 extra points. That can be huge in the game. When you get into Klingons, they also have a lot of personnel in the early sets that are just single skill. But there are some good ones that come up. Like Kavada, he's a command level officer with leadership and navigation. That's actually huge amongst the early Klingon cards. Thopak, he's a security. He has biology transporter skill, but he can also download the Batleth. That can be huge on away missions. Kolar, command icon. He's an officer. Yes, it's a Delta Quadrant card, but diplomacy, honor, anthropology, leadership, stellar cartography, and he can download the auto-destruct sequence. Huge asset to have in a Delta Quadrant Klingon deck. Cardassians have a lot of interesting skills and a lot of varied skills. Why I like a lot of Cardassian personnel, including the deck I've made up recently, take Goma Set for an example. Command level, officer, diplomacy and honor, but with the secondary skill of medical. So you have an officer that also has medical, and in terms of Cardassian deck, that can be huge. For the Bajorans, a lot of their personnel are weak, but then you have personnel like Jaro Essa. He's a VIP that has diplomacy, leadership, greed, treachery ×2, and his cunning is +3 if he's with Vedek Win, also huge. You have Jem'Hadar that have useful skills. Aractorel, he's an officer that has leadership, transporter skill, physics. He can download invasive beam-in. Hello. There are Ferengi with great skills, as I have in my Ferengi deck. Gagus, who has a command icon. He's an officer that has computer skill, the secondary skill of science, acquisition, greed. Your holographic and Ferengi personnel may mix at this location. When you're dealing with non-aligned cards, cards like Devanoni Rel, that's a VIP, but he has empathy, diplomacy, and treachery. There's a couple missions he can almost do by himself. Timison, he's a civilian, but he has a secondary skill of engineer, astrophysics, physics, scores 10 points if he helps solve the test mission. That can be huge. Yes, he's discarded when you reach 60 points or more, but the pros outweigh the cons. Cards like Civilian Odo, he's a civilian, but security times 2 as a secondary, computer skill, honor, and he can download the classic communicator. When it comes to Borg, these are Borg I have in my deck, and I've also used them before. Cards like 2 of 11, who's a transport drone, secondary skill of engineer, transporter skill, where present allows your transporters to beam through opponent's shields. Unstoppable. 9 of 17, multiplexer drone. When on your ship during battle, that ship may use total weapons against X different targets, where X equals number of red icon Borg aboard. I have a decent amount of red icon Borg in my deck. So, again, my Borg deck, this makes it even more unstoppable than it already is. 6 of 11 is a quantum drone. Physics, navigation, the secondary skill of science. When on your ship, may download an alternate universe doorway in place of 1 card draw. That can be huge. So now you see why choosing personnel can be the most critical part of deck building. There is a lot to take into account. And there's even some affiliations I haven't covered, but you get the gist of what I'm trying to tell you. To give you an example of how critical personnel are to a deck when you're building it, a normal deck building session for me takes about 3 hours, give or take maybe 10-15 minutes here and there, depending on what I'm doing. About an hour, hour and a half of that is taken up just with personnel alone, sometimes more. I can breeze through missions because I know what I want to do. Dilemmas are not that hard to deal with if you have a plan in your head. And then you have your power cards, which you'd put at the end. But personnel take up a huge chunk of time and thought, and you really got to be careful with that. Have a great day, everybody.